All right, good morning. Welcome. I hope those of you who are able to join us for Beth's session this morning feel nourished, as she was saying. And now our first full presentation for the next hour is with George DeRiso, who is a lecturer and professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. He is an experienced executive and entrepreneur. He's been a professor of entrepreneurship for basically 15 years or more at CU Boulder and has taught entrepreneurship all over the world. So I'm very excited to welcome George to LSW 20 for his talk from Wannapreneur to Entrepreneur. And I'll just turn it over to you, George.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. All right. So let's get started. Today I'm going to talk just briefly about a set of processes or a stream of processes that will help you to launch your business or help you work through some of the bugs in your current business if you've already launched one. I want to share with you a number of models that are kind of mental models and a good way of thinking about how to get yourself started. Just to give you a little bit more of my background, I spent 11 years at Apple. That's probably the most entrepreneurial experience I've had in a corporation. Is where I learned to be an entrepreneur. And after Apple launched 9 technology-based startup companies over the course of my career. I'm happy to answer questions about any of those as we go. And if you have questions or comments, please do share. So let's get started. So I want to start by talking about you, because you as an entrepreneur are the center of your entrepreneurial universe. So the first question I have, of course, is what motivates you? What makes you want to be an entrepreneur? Did you lose your job? Did you come up with a great idea, or did you find someone else with a great idea and decide to collaborate with them? Are you inspired by other entrepreneurs? Are you driven by money? What motivates you? That's a really central question, and it's important to understand what motivates you in order to begin the expression of yourself into an entrepreneurial venture. So where do you go from here? First thing I want to offer you is a compass. And that compass is a model that I work with a lot with my students in universities and around the world. I call it I, we, it. So I is the embodiment of you. Who are you? It answers the question, who are you? It's your self-awareness. We, that's the embodiment of the people you surround yourself in your entrepreneurial universe. So that may be your team members, it may be your suppliers, it might be your customers, and so on. And then it, that's what we typically teach in a business school. That's your revenue model. That's your business model. It's your distribution model. It's all of those sorts of things that comprise your business. From there, we start looking at how do you gain an entrepreneurial mindset? That is, what does an entrepreneurial think and how do they think? And here are some links that I'll share with you through my presentation. You may have access to the presentation in a couple of different ways. One is it'll be available through the Longmont Startup Week website. Another is you can contact me directly and ask me for the presentation. And then you can click on these links and learn more about the sorts of things that make up your entrepreneurial mindset. Remember that entrepreneurship is a craft. It requires practice. It's something that you do rather than something that you just read about and inherently understand. Some years ago, I did a study on the attributes of great leaders, great entrepreneurs, and great innovators. And I grouped those characteristics and then overlaid them in a Venn diagram. And you can see that about 30% of them are in the center of this diagram. That means that these particular attributes are inherent in each of those roles. So if you zoom in on those, one of the first things you see is that self-awareness is a big part of being an entrepreneur or a great leader or a great innovator. How do you get to be self-aware? So those links that I shared with you a few moments ago will help start you out in that direction. But be aware that it's a long journey. Self-awareness is something that we don't teach in school. And as parents, we're not really good at imparting to our children. So it's something that you have to explore and really dedicate yourself to understanding over the long term, because as you grow and evolve, you have to be aware of how you're changing over time. All of these other ones are completely teachable, and yet we don't typically teach them, but they can be learned and they can be practiced. So one of the big complaints I hear from entrepreneurs when I'm working with them is that I don't have a great idea. How can I be an entrepreneur? Of my 9 startups, not a single one of those was my idea. And there's an Italian man who is named Ernesto Ciroli. He's a consultant for entrepreneurs. He has a great TED Talk if you're interested. And Ernesto Ciroli says that to be successful, a startup has to have 3 things. And those 3 things are someone who makes something, someone who sells something, and someone who manages the money. And he points out that in the history of the world, no single person has ever possessed all 3 of those talents. So if you're not the idea person, maybe you're the business person, or maybe you're the salesperson. That's okay. Ideas are everywhere. You can create an idea, you can develop it yourself. You may have observed a problem or seen something in another country that doesn't exist in this country and want to bring it back here. Or you might just be on a journey of personal inquiry, in which case I would invite you to use my dead simple business model, which essentially is 4 questions. The first question is, whom do you serve? And that seems like a pretty fundamental question with an easy answer. It's not. By that, I mean really intimately understanding who you are going to market to and who you're going to sell to. And to do that, you really have to dig deeply into the characteristics of the individual or individuals or segment that you want to sell to. The second question is, how do you serve them? Again, it looks fairly straightforward and innocuous, but again, the real understanding of this question comes in knowing what kind of value you are providing to your audience. And that value might be embodied in your product or your services or the whole product, which includes everything about how someone might do business with you. The third question, what must you have to do so? That is a bit more mundane. That simply answers the questions of how are your operations fashioned? What kinds of processes do you have in place? How do you distribute your product? Where do you market? And so on. And then there's a fourth question, probably the most important question that embodies all of these things, which is why. Why do you want to do this? Why is it important? Why does the world need what you're going to deliver to them? Once you go through that and you figured out some of the answers to those questions, you begin to validate what your assumptions are. You validate your idea when you've researched the market, when you've evaluated the industry in which your company will reside, when you've started building relationships with customers, suppliers, team members, and so on. When you found the right team members, those are the people who fill in the gaps that you have, those people who sell or manage the money or have great ideas. When you've decided on a business model that will work, and you've proven that, when you've crunched the numbers and you know that you can execute using the financial model that you've built a prototype and your target customers love it. And most importantly, when you've calculated what your affordable loss is and prepared yourself for failure. That's kind of a big one because we often think of failure as a bad thing. Failure is not the opposite of success. It's one of the key ingredients to success. If you think about what I said earlier, that entrepreneurship is a craft, and it's a craft that must be practiced, then you understand that, like anything that requires practice, you're going to fail again and again until you master it. For example, you didn't learn to walk the morning you were born. You had to practice walking and you fell down many times. You didn't learn a musical instrument the first time you placed your hands on the keyboard. You had to practice. That practice is nothing more than repeated failure, and it's essential to becoming successful. Once you figure out and you've validated your market, you need to begin building your legal foundation. This is particularly important because you must get it right the first time. That includes a whole lot of different things that if you fail to get right, then legal help will cost you much, much, much more to fix. So things like incorporating your business, keeping yourself separate from business and personal accounting and so on, your taxes, your contracts, your agreements, and especially good record keeping. So you see this thing on the right. That, you may be wondering what it is a list. If you could blow that up, that's a line item list that was given to me by Google when I sold a software company to them. And that list represents all the things that Google wanted to see and verify before they would buy the software company. So that list has probably 350 to 400 items on there. So good record keeping, good record hygiene is critically important, because at some point you're going to ask for investment capital or you're going to exit, and somebody's going to ask a lot of questions about the history of your business. Once you figured out the legal basis, you can begin to develop your product, your customer, and your team. And this is an iterative product or process, excuse me. So focus on prototyping, validating, incorporating your feedback, and repeating. Find customers who want to buy your product and work with them and make sure that they are part of your customer database. You should be adding contacts all the time to your customer database and asking for referrals. Find team members who believe the way that you believe, who have faith in the product and the possibilities in the marketplace, and who want to join you. And make sure that they fill in gaps that you don't have covered well with your own talents and skills. We can't be everything to everyone. And then really figure out how to manage your marketing, that is demand generation, how to manage your sales, that's the transactional part, and how to manage your fulfillment, the promises that you make to the marketplace. Make sure you have solid metrics in place and look for outcomes rather than outputs. And then you're ready to launch. So where's the money to do that? Maybe it's in your own pocket, or maybe you have friends and family who can help support the launch of your business. Maybe you grow it organically. You begin selling your product with as little money as possible and fund it through the proceeds from the sales. You want to market your venture and your product, and you must focus entirely on selling at the very beginning. Every person in a startup company is a salesperson. Listen to your customers, take the feedback and incorporate it in improving your business, and encourage their feedback, encourage criticism. A lot of companies really don't do well with managing their customer complaints, but customer complaints are solid gold. They tell you what's wrong with your product or what's wrong with your company or what's wrong with the processes of doing business with you. And so you must really try to get that feedback from your customers. And to do that, you need a robust way of capturing that feedback and cycling it into your product. Your number one imperative, like in any business, is to survive. Whatever it takes to do that, you need to do that. So I want to talk a little bit about the entrepreneurial process. This is kind of an oversimplified flowchart of how things happen, but it incorporates something I call the 4 loops. And those 4 loops are critical. Any company that is successful will be functioning with these 4 loops as the engine of success. And the way they work is this. You start with the ideation. Once you have an idea for a product, you're not done. That is an iterative looping process where you look at the idea, you validate it to make sure that you have an opportunity to bring that to market, you develop a business concept, and you start over again. If Apple had only stopped with the iPhone, the first iPhone that they'd introduced in 2007, do you think we'd all be happy with that? Probably not. So it's something that you work with on your existing products and something that you work with on new products that come through another loop that I'll show you in a moment. There's always a validation process. You're always looking at the market, making sure you have the right customers, making sure you're reaching the right geographies. You're looking at your industry, your competitive landscape, and that's a constant process to gauge your success against the results in the marketplace and against the competitors that you're working to either align with or compete with. And in the innovation process, the product process, where you're designing a solution, prototyping it, and again, going through the validation process to make sure it's exactly the right thing. This is your innovation loop. And finally, you have the operations loop. This is where you're building your model, building your operations, you're marketing, you're selling, you're building product and delivering it. And again, this is iterative. You're always trying to gain efficiency in how you operate in order to increase the margins that you will get from your sales. If you're successful, you'll go on to grow and scale. And in order to do that, you need a culture in your company that is willing to and expecting to scale. So beginning to build your culture is critically important as well. And if you do so, you have a culture that will help you to optimize the operations, that will help you with your innovation, that will help you with your strategy. You'll have natural leaders coming out of the team and emerging who can take on subsidiary companies or subsidiary product lines. You can stay competitive that way. And remember that growth costs money. It's often the task of a venture capitalist or an angel investor to actually fund the growth more so than funding the initial stages. And last, I'll say, having an exit plan, to me at least, is like planning your divorce before you get married. I'm not a big believer in exit plans. Rather, in my startups, I focused on creating value, because if you create value and you build your company with that focus, people will show up encouraging you with different enticements for exiting, either through an IPO or through a merger or acquisition or some other means. So build the value and the exit opportunities show up themselves. I'm going to stop here. I'm going to put up my contact details. I would love to connect with you. I'm happy to chat with any of you or help you in any way I can. There's my mobile phone, my email address, my Instagram. You have it all. And at this point, I would love to hear from you in terms of what kind of questions you might have for moving forward in your own ventures.
Well, awesome. Thank you, George. If you're watching this live stream, you can comment in our Facebook chats or on our YouTube channel. If you're watching this on our website, you'll have to go to one of those 2 pages to ask some of those questions, but we'll see them pop in and we'll throw them up for George to answer. I did have one question off the top of my head, and some of the long process. Well, actually, I want to ask about Google's legal requirements, but first, because that's ridiculous. But first, do you have any, or like, what recommendations would you have for people to test and validate their product in the market? That's something that I know I get a lot of questions from entrepreneurs on. Is like, okay, I have this idea. What are the best ways or the best methods I can go out and actually test something?
So there's a couple of ways you can do that. One is that you can choose to build out a a very detailed concept description and present that, obviously. That's largely what you end up doing with investors and so on. But if you're really wanting the customer's reaction, rapid prototyping is a great way to get there. It's cheap, it's easy, and it can be done very quickly. And Tom Chi, C-H-I, who used to run the Google X Lab and was the father of Google Glass, is a great resource for rapid prototyping. So take a look at Tom Chi on the website or contact me, and I'm happy to talk more about that. That's a great question.
Awesome. So there's a question from Dan Christian that says, do you have advice on building or finding a founding team?
Yes, the first step, of course, is becoming critically aware of yourself in a way so that you understand your shortcomings and so that you understand what you're really good at doing. What you want to do is find not people so much that you like. Nepotism rarely works well in a startup, but rather look for people who can fill in the gaps for you. So for me, for example, I understand financial modeling and I teach that, but I hate doing it in my own companies. And so some of my first hires were people who were just beside themselves when they had the opportunity to sit down and play with a spreadsheet and build models and stuff like that. They were totally geeking out over spreadsheets. So look for people who fill in where you have limitations and who can really complement the talents you have.
Awesome. Thank you. So I have to ask about that Google legal requirement, because that's crazy. Did you complete the sale or successfully finish the?
Yes, completed the negotiation, the sale, sold the company for about 250% above Google's original offer. Thank goodness for good record keeping. It's really effective in propelling the deal. It took from start to finish about 6 months to close that deal.
Because that was an enormous legal list.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, it makes sense. You want to know, if you're a buyer of a company, that you are buying unencumbered intellectual property, that you are buying a customer list that is valid and are buying customers. You're buying a revenue stream, really. You want to know that you have contracts in place that are meaningful. You want to know that you have not pissed off employees that are likely to sue you or have compromised your intellectual property in some way or have rights to it in some way. You want to make sure that your cap tables are right so that you have the equity that people are entitled to, all detailed and so on. So there's a lot to it. And as you go, you almost have to keep kind of a legal eye on pretty much everything just to make sure you're doing it right. And believe me, there are nightmarish stories about people who don't pay attention or don't think it's very important and end up paying up to hundreds of thousands of dollars to fix problems.
Yeah, that's costs best avoided.
Absolutely. Doing it right is the cheapest way to do it, even though we all agree that attorney fees can be quite exorbitant.
Mm-hmm. So one of the early parts of the process that you outlined for testing some of this, as other people may add or ask questions in our Facebook and YouTube feeds, one of the things that I noticed, and you addressed this early on, was building self-awareness and understanding why you're doing this. That's part of your dead simple business model, but also at that very start, starting to be an entrepreneur, having that self-awareness. So what can people do to cultivate that self-awareness and that understanding of themselves before, through as well, the entrepreneurial process?
So the links that I provided are kind of starting points for that journey. It requires that you be curious, that you endorse the notion of lifelong learning, and that you are focused on yourself in a very objective way as opposed to very subjective. And there's some things that you can do to change if you're not happy. You should assess yourself. There's a Carol Dweck's mindset test is there, Angela Duckworth's grit test. There are ways that you can actually train to those characteristics that were in the center of that Venn diagram. You can actually nurture those and train and practice those, and that really puts you in a great position to be either a great leader, a great innovator, or a great entrepreneur. And most entrepreneurs have to be all three, at least at the very start. So that's a great place to start exploring. And be honest with yourself, emotionally and intellectually honest. And it's challenging, and it's often painful to realize that most of us are not quite as smart as we think we are. I know I'm not. So, that self-awareness journey can be a little bit painful as well.
Definitely. I too am not as smart as I think I am, that's for sure. Actually, I was wondering, could you jump back to that Venn diagram of the different qualities between leaders and entrepreneurs and et cetera?
Yes, stand by.
Yeah, that's fine. There it is.
There it is.
So it's kind of funny. It's a very small piece of the puzzle, but I saw that innovators' practical is the one thing that sits outside of the other two circles for innovators. Could you speak a little bit about that? It was something that I just had glanced at during your presentation.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I found that quite odd as well. I think in this sense, practical means that they operate at a level of creativity that has to be maintained within a framework of reality. And so I think that innovators tend to create that framework first and say, this is kind of the operating space where we can create. So in that sense, it's very practical, whereas leaders tend to be a little bit more visionary and entrepreneurs tend to be a lot more experimental and are quite willing to color outside of the lines.
That's really fascinating. That makes a lot of sense. Shannon dropped in a comment and asked, how are you seeing the dynamics of raising capital change given the COVID environment? Do you have any perspective on this?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Shannon. Thanks for being here. The COVID has changed things in the same way that many kinds of economic disasters change things for investors. So if you're an institutional investor, the most common action is to flee for those safer bets. So you'll see early stage VCs starting to move upstream to more stable environments for investing. So companies that have been around a long time, they've maybe taken 2 or 3 rounds, and you're not going to get the kinds of returns that you want, but you're taking far less risk. So really it's about risk mitigation for any investor. And if they see a lot of risk, they're not likely to invest. And so in an environment where the economy is struggling, they look for lower risk opportunities. In our environment in COVID, what's been really interesting is watching the public markets, because you'd never know there's an economic crisis. And that, I suspect, is due to a lot of speculative investing, thinking that these are businesses that are going to profit in the longer or short term and longer term both. For example, Gilead or AstraZeneca or some of those people working on vaccines and treatments, or they're industries that are essential industries that we now know are going to have to adapt to kind of a new way of operating in the context of a pandemic.
Awesome. Thank you. By the way, Shannon says hi.
I see that.
All right. Seth drops in a comment from YouTube. Any recommendations or thoughts on getting off zero for risk adverse entrepreneurs? How do you make those first steps?
It's kind of like learning to swim. You got to get in the water. So probably the easiest thing to do is figure out a really safe thing to do, like selling lemonade on a hot day or something else. One of the things that I do with my students from time to time is I will give them an entrepreneurial challenge. I'll form them into teams, and then I give them an investment of $5, $10, something like that. and they have exactly 2 hours to go out and make more money using only that original money. So give yourself that kind of an exercise. Take $20 and see if you can turn it into 40 somehow in a very short period of time. Start cutting your teeth on small, sort of safe exercises or less risky exercises and see where you get to.
That's awesome. Are there any standout stories from that exercise with some of the students? Because I'm sure they get creative trying to.
They get very creative. The one thing that I tell them is that they can't do anything unethical or illegal. So that kills about half of their creative thinking. But often they come back having basically shopped themselves as a contractor, a 2-hour contractor for a tedious task that nobody else wants to do. So they'll knock on company doors doing that. They'll wash windows. They'll build something. So one group of entrepreneurs had a charity build where they had water balloons, and you bought the water balloons and you could throw it at one of the team members and try and soak them. And the pleasure in doing that was quite profitable for them. They ended up about tripling their money. So
that's pretty impressive, honestly.
They do well.
Yeah. Is there one of the things that you discussed in the process that you outlined was around ideation and specifically around like meeting industry gaps. And this is part of the conversation that a lot of entrepreneurs have around identifying an opportunity in an industry. So is there, even if somebody, let's say somebody has identified an industry, oh, I want to move into aerospace or blockchain, or I want to start a food truck in my town. Let's do full spectrum here. Do you have any recommendations for or a process or questions that they can ask themselves to figure out how to meet those industry gaps or even how to identify them?
Sure, there are a number of ways, and really it's a process of inquiry. So entrepreneurs, more than business people, tend to be scientists. They're experimenters, or detectives. They're probing and finding out stuff. The central job for an entrepreneur is to turn unknowns into knowns. And the way you do that is ask a lot of questions. So where do you go to find out industry information? You go to the industry itself. So if you're looking at something like, phone accessories, then look at companies that do phone accessories and find out what they're doing, find out what they're talking about, explore their websites. They tend to have press releases or white papers or other sorts of things that give you clues to how they're thinking. And then find people in those industries and talk to them and say, what's next for you guys? Or what do you see coming in the future? And so on. And then go to customers and say, what do you think about the current phone accessories? What works for you? What doesn't? What would you change if you could change anything about this cell phone case or this headset or something else? Who do you think is an industry leader and why? And so you start gathering that kind of information, and you'll start seeing that there are lots and lots of gaps, lots of cracks. When you're in a pandemic, that exposes a lot of those things. And I'm sure everyone has noticed that there's a lot of stuff that doesn't work the way we think that it was meant to work. And the consequence of that is that there's a great deal of opportunity showing up. So I saw this morning, for example, a photograph of an outdoor cinema, a drive-in cinema that was done for boats. So it was done in France on the Seine River. And there's a company now that's called, I think it's called Beyond Entertainment or something like that. And they basically created a drive-in theater for boaters. And they put a giant screen and speakers and amplifiers on the bank of the river. And boaters showed up and moored and watched a program, watched a movie. And they paid for that privilege. So, and these guys are thinking, we'll take it to any town that has boaters, lake towns, ocean towns, river towns, whatever. And they're starting to build a business. So look for those opportunities that show up because of things that happen, disruptions in the industry.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all that we have. Making sure no other final comments are coming in. So thank you so much, George, for joining us. I appreciate you kicking off LSW 20, and we'll be back on the hour every hour today with new sessions.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much, Morgan. Thanks for everyone who showed up and participated. Again, if you want my contact details, they're available to you. Please reach out. Happy to talk to any of you.
Thank you.
Take care.